In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people living around potential targets such as military bases and chemical plants may be advised to evacuate.
Hello, Sublation Media viewers. Thanks for joining the Sublation Magazine show, coming every Tuesday around 9 o'clock a.m., and that's Portland time. I'm Douglas Lane. I'm the author of a novella called Wave of Mutilation, which I'm going to mention briefly in this stream. And I'm also the head of Sublation Media. With me is, of course...
Hi, I'm Ashley Frawley. I'm a sociologist at the University of Kent. I am the co-host every Tuesday, and I'm the author of two books, one of which I will talk about a little bit today as we kind of talk about kind of influences and things like that. And I'm also the author of a new journal article that's coming out soon that I finished the other day, and another 10,000 word article that I'm just finishing the end of. So I'm looking really tired at the moment because quite belatedly, I have learned that I write only about 40 words an hour, and I should just accept that and realize that that's how long it's going to take.
Who are you writing for, and what are the articles about?
So the first article is
Uh-oh. Did I freeze? It seems like you froze up there for a second. Uh-oh. Ashley seems to have frozen. Well, when she returns, we'll find out what her articles are about. But while we're waiting for her to return and to get out from under the iceberg that has frozen her in place, I thought I'll bring up the topics for today's episode. We're going to be talking about, if she comes back, and if not, I'll be talking about the way the Democrats are running on censorship as a primary plank in their platform. Over the last week, Hillary Clinton appeared on MSNBC to push the idea that what was needed is new legislation outlawing speech that might echo the ideas that would come from a foreign power, particularly Russia, I think. And then the AOC followed up with some propaganda for censorship, and then some old footage of Kamala Harris has been making the rounds. So before we dive into kind of a brief retrospective on Fredric Jameson, I thought I would show this clip, this montage of clips from Hillary Clinton, AOC, and Kamala Harris. Here it is.
Trump back in 2016, but I also think there are Americans who are engaged in this kind of propaganda, and whether they should be civilly or even in some cases criminally charged is something that would be a better deterrence.
You know, I do think that several members of Congress in some of my discussions have brought up media literacy, because that is a part of what happened here. And we're going to have to figure out how we rein in our media environment so that you can't just spew disinformation and misinformation. It's one thing to have differing opinions, but it's another thing entirely to just say things that are false. And so that's something that we're looking into.
He has lost his privileges, and it should be taken down. And the bottom line is that you can't say that you have one rule for Facebook and you have a different rule for Twitter. The same rule has to apply, which is that there has to be a responsibility that is placed on these social media sites to understand their power. They are directly speaking to millions and millions of people without any level of oversight or regulation, and that has to stop.
All right, so that is the new campaign platform for Kamala Harris. It's time to stop this uncontrolled speech, particularly online, People can't just say any old thing they want anymore. If you say the wrong thing, you could end up in prison. And that's what they're promising for 2025. That's their 2025 agenda. Now, one of the commenters has said that I should balance out my critique by noting that Republicans are the ones pushing for book bans. And that's true. And I oppose the banning of books, of course. Although my understanding is that most of the time, these campaigns to ban books are taking place within school districts and local communities, and that the battles around books has to do with middle school libraries primarily. So the question of what should be in a middle school library is a bit different than the question of whether or not the government should be setting up laws or regulations to censor speech in private companies, whether that's newspapers or magazines or cable channels or the internet. So while you can push for a broader array of books being available in middle school libraries, and I think we ought to, the two issues are not equivalent. I will say that Donald Trump's recent statements about flag burning left me feeling unsettled and a bit nauseous, as he said that he was going to make flag burning illegal and subject to 1 year in prison, and that he would change the Constitution if he had to. But I don't think that the likelihood of that happening is as high as the likelihood of the continuation of the disinformation war under Kamala Harris. That's already in place now. These institutions already exist. They're actually being taken to the Supreme Court again to try to stop the massive censorship that's going on. So it is there's a difference in character even there, but I would say that I'm not at all confident that that the Trump campaign represents some sort of truly committed political effort to roll back the censorship apparatus, and whoever wins in November, the struggle will continue. But anyway, so I just showed the clips of AOC, Hillary Clinton, and Kamala Harris calling for censorship. Ashley, have you seen those on Twitter?
I have not. So recap for the people who are just joining.
Well, okay. Clinton said that that the domestic population should face either civil or criminal lawsuits if they are repeating foreign propaganda. And she said that in the context of the way Russia was boosting Trump. So it was aimed, I think, particularly at Trump supporters. But her claim was that there should be criminal charges brought against those who repeat foreign propaganda. Not even if they simply, like, it's not like if they are foreign agents or are being paid to spread Russian propaganda, but rather even if they simply say similar things or the same things as someone who might be associated with the Russian state or the Chinese state or hell, maybe the Israeli state, whoever, if they're shown to be repeating talking points from our enemies, they should be facing jail time, possibly. Then AOC said that something had to be done to stop the scourge of disinformation that's online. People should have the right to disagree, but not to repeat false things. And the trouble there is, like, who's in a position to say exactly what is false, especially around.
Well, Doug, the Ministry of Truth, obviously.
Yeah. So right, which they tried to set up, but failed to over the last 4 years. They were going to create a disinformation governance board or something like that.
Mhm.
And then the last clip was from Kamala, and that was, I think, from 2019, where she was saying that Twitter had to ban Donald Trump, and that the same moderation policies needed to be applied across all social media companies through some sort of oversight committee, maybe, that there needed to be
Okay.
federal oversight of the of social media companies in particular. But if you look at a little bit further into the war on disinformation and the way the Department of Homeland Security is pushing for this war to continue, it is actually a whole of society effort. So it wouldn't be limited just to social media companies. And it has not been strictly limited to social media companies. So this is, I think, a defining characteristic of the post-neoliberal era. This blatant disregard for the First Amendment in the United States and for the concept of free speech around the world, and the need for more direct and explicit state control over what they call cognitive infrastructure, or at least a perceived need for it. So I just wanted to begin with that.
Okay. So I noticed that you said post neoliberal, and I know that you and I will not agree on this, and we have, because we're coming from different points of view. But I do think that the best way to characterize this, as I've said many times before, is post liberal. And although David Chandler has gone over to the dark side, I do think some of his writing from around 2016 captures this really, really well, where he says it makes more sense to call these phenomena not neoliberal, but rather post-liberal, which signifies the end of the liberal problematic, the end of that era, which was begun with the Enlightenment and which championed, however partially, the idea of the democratic subject. And I've told this story a million times before, but that subject was necessary in order to fell feudalism to the ground, right? But once that job was done, then that democratic subject, that subject that demands a say in how things are run, it needs to be destroyed, because what happened is people began to demand a say in how things are run. They almost had a right to work put into the French Constitution before the powers that be, the bourgeoisie, realized and smartened up. And so that we are now on the receiving end of almost since the very beginning, since the end of the 18th century, we've been on the receiving end of a progressive attempt to destroy the liberal subject that was the foundation for liberal democratic societies. And it had to be destroyed because it cannot be realized fully within capitalism. It can be sort of freed. So it makes sense to call it post-liberal, because it is burying that. It doesn't even I mean, I suppose sometimes it does pay lip service to it. They would talk about democracy, but what do they really mean by democracy?
Mm-hmm. Well, listen, I think this is an excellent point you raise, and one that we could use as a bridge or a segue into a conversation about Fredric Jameson. Oh, did you freeze again, Ashley? Well, anyway, since she did appear to freeze again, I'm going to use it as a segue into a discussion of Fredric Jameson, who recently died. He died on the 22nd of this month, in September 2024, at the age of 90. He had taught at Duke University since 1985, and his books include The Political Unconscious, Postmodernism, or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, and The Antinomies of Realism. And one way to interpret, I'm glad you're back, Ashley. One way to interpret Fredric Jameson is as a Marxist cultural critic who marked, maybe a little belatedly, the turn away from liberal modernity to postmodern, post-liberalism, perhaps, or as I would call it, neoliberalism. So Fredric Jameson's passing might be provide us with an opportunity to discuss just where we think we are politically now, and whether or not the symptoms that Jameson described in 1984 in his essay in the New Left Review, which was titled the same thing as his book, which came later, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, whether what he described then still obtains today, or if we are in a postmodern or post liberal moment. And post liberal wouldn't just mean liberal, and postmodern wouldn't just mean modern, right? So, what do you think? Have you spent much time reading or thinking about the works of Fredric Jameson in the past, Ashley?
So what's funny is that and when I was writing my first book, I engaged quite a bit with and just generally up until about 2014, I engaged quite a lot with Sartre and Jameson, and as I was sort of reading in preparation for this, because I thought, oh gosh, it's been such a long time since I read any of this stuff. I'm not sure it's had any effect on me. I don't know. It's too far outside my expertise. As I was reading through, trying to sort of refresh my memory, I realized just how much of everything that I think is rooted in Jameson and Jean-Paul Sartre. And I am so horrified by that because I've buried it completely in my consciousness. But I suppose that's what happens when I'm not a philosopher, I'm a sociologist, right? So when I, read and think, I use philosophy to think through some phenomenon in the world. Once I've thought it through, I'm done. So it's interesting how this stuff just sort of creeps into my consciousness, but I wouldn't be able to sit and give a lecture on it. But yeah, I really, especially Sartre, I really did not think that I had retained very much, but apparently it's my whole outlook and way of thinking.
Yeah, for me, it was like to reread. I reread Fredric Jameson's essay this morning, and for me to reread him was certainly in nostalgia. Gave me a feeling in nostalgia, which is ironic given that how much of the essay is about nostalgia. But my first professional short story sale was in 1999 when I was 28 years old. My second professional short story sale was in 2000, and that story was for an anthology called Wine Dark Sea, and the story was called The Suburbs of the Citadel of Thought. And quite a lot of what was in that short story had to do with urban architecture and it was actually a story that was attempting to critique modernism and a certain liberal reason. It was written from the point of view of a mental patient who was schizophrenic, and and it was a very metafictional story. Later on in 2011, my first published novella that came out as a little book, Wave of Mutilation, was about an architect who was into the kind of architecture, googie architecture, the kind of architecture that is featured in and mentioned in quite a lot in Venturi's Learning from Las Vegas, which is mentioned in Fredric Jameson's essay. So I too, rereading Jameson, realized how big of an influence he had on me in the 90s as I was an undergrad and reading anything I could get my hands on that might mention Philip K. Dick. So I got a hold of Fredric Jameson for that reason. So yeah, I think he should not be underestimated in terms of the American Marxist left, in terms of the breadth of his influence and the high regard that he's been held in by many. The other thing I remember from the 90s when he was quite big was one of my friends a friend of mine named Jerry, who had given me Gromsky's prison notebooks as a wedding present. he complained about Jameson saying that Jameson made like thousands and thousands of dollars for every speaking engagement that he made, and that he was the most highly paid Marxist in the world at that time. I think that's maybe a bit of an unfair criticism. Why shouldn't he make a little bit of money? But there was a sense of Jameson as nearly the next Sartre or the next Marcuse amongst certain hipster circles, anyway, in the 90s. So,
yeah,
go ahead.
There was a comment in the chat where someone said, when is she going toward economic sociology? Cultural analysis is weak. And that's actually one of the areas where, as I was going through my first book, and because I remembered that that's when I had really done a lot of reading of Jameson, Semiotics of Happiness, by the way, my first book, and going through my old notes and that sort of thing, I realized that one of the core animating forces of my work is this basic idea, which comes from Jameson, that ideology is an attempt to solve real contradictions in imagination. I even use that exact wording without citing Jameson. It's like I picked it up through the ether and thought it was some smart thing that I thought of myself. And I was like, no, actually, you idiot, that is Jameson. But it's such a profound and important insight that people think of, especially Marxists. Like, you think of culture as this incidental kind of something incidental to what really matters. But the thing that I find fascinating and what makes me a sociologist and what moves me is when people are telling stories about something, when people are talking about the world, when they're talking about problems, they are narrating some contradiction. They're telling some story, and they often tie it up in a neat little bow. They'll tell stories about, there's a simple problem and a simple solution. But I like to think like, what problem are they what problem are they perceiving in the world that they are telling stories about? What are they solving in imagination that can't be solved in the real world? And I think that deep cultural analysis, I like to think anyway, kind of differentiates some of my work. I don't want to be like too self-indulgent here, but differentiate some of my work from what I like to think of as a kind of crass or vulgar materialism, where people see people talking about some issue in the world, and then they immediately go, oh yeah, this is caused by capitalism. And I'm so sorry to say this, because I just said crass and vulgar, but I do think that Mark Fisher's Capitalist Realism falls into that early in the book, otherwise being an excellent book, and also drawing on Jameson, or at least what is often attributed to Jameson, that is the line that it's easier to imagine the end of capitalism, the end of the world, than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. But I think he falls into that, where he sees like all of these alarmist claims about mental health problems, and he goes immediately to so he thinks this is a real thing. Capitalism, cause, effect, our brains makes us this way. Point to our side. It is capitalism makes us unhappy. Ergo, obviously, we need to move beyond it. And what I just wrote in one of the papers that I just submitted is that what this fails to see is the degree to which that story is part of that solving in imagination a deeper contradiction that cannot be solved in reality. And an attempt also in reality to solve a deeper contradiction through the control of human behavior and human emotion and human thought. So I think someone like Fisher, while drawing a lot on Jameson, fails to recognize just how much the story of mental health, the story of emotion and problematic emotion, is bound up with that ideological or that bureaucratic control that later in the book he criticizes, where he talks about like market Stalinism and that sort of thing, that actually constructing human beings is inherently weak and damaged by the world around us, and therefore in need of all of this oversight, all of this help seeking. It gets this sort of like anti-capitalist wash, but is very much part of this attempt to control the minutiae of everyday life as a response to a deep belief that the problems of capitalism are ultimately down to the human brain and the human mind. And if we could just control them and make them choose right, then the problems would go away. So I think that's one of the sort of, an example of how sort of Jameson, I think, has influenced me, and I think insufficiently influenced others, if I could say. But I do want to sort of underscore that it's otherwise an excellent book.
Yeah, well, the book, this essay in the New Left Review provides us a nice, quick summary in a way. You don't have to read the entire big, thick tome to get to the bottom of at least the skeleton of Jameson's argument. Again, that he published in 1985, and I think probably wrote in 1984, which is, I love everything that comes from 1984. Because it was this moment where, everyone had to do some reassessing of how the big capitalist modernist project was going, and were we in danger of becoming and falling into the trap that Orwell had predicted that we were going to fall into. So anyhow, it's worth noting that Fredric Jameson had a definition of postmodernism, which was political and ideological, kind of tucked away at the beginning of his essay. For Jameson, the postmodern condition was the condition that arose after the end of ideology, the end of art, the end of social class, after the crisis of Leninism, the end of social democracy, and after the crisis of the welfare state. So, for Jameson, there is certainly an illiberalism in the postmodern logic, the logic of late capitalism, and he did historicize postmodernism and tied it to political economy by bringing forward the term late capitalism as a way to understand what postmodernism was. Late capitalism being the moment where capitalism had truly taken over the productive economic relations that ran the world, what capitalism had become truly global. And so that was what brought on postmodernism. It's worth investigating, and I'm going to talk to Alfie Bound about this more deeply next week. But just to what degree late capitalism is an optimistic term, and why it might be an optimistic term. What could be found in postmodernism that could be at least a precursor of some sort of revolutionary change is worth thinking about. To what degree Jameson was an optimist is worth taking up. But for Jameson, he was a literary critic and an art critic, and so he approached the cultural logic of late capitalism or postmodernism from that perspective, and he talked about how postmodernism might be thought of as a rejection of the modernist schools of art, including the modernist school of poetry, but said most of all, you could understand and see the postmodern turn most clearly within the world of architecture. And he, in his essay, spoke about and wrote about the Bonaventure Hotel. And so I actually have a clip. I always like to run the clip. I have a clip about the Bonaventure Hotel from a documentary about Jameson. And let's see if I can find that clip. Here it is.
One important issue is about the spatial organisation of the postmodern city and how we're led to submit to its controls as well as to its charms. A castle city in which bodies of people are controlled.
The Bonaventure Hotel reflects the very nature of the postmodern experience, both literally and figuratively. The outside of the building reflects the enormous growth of a postmodern downtown, a kind of carceral city, a city of international capital and corporate capital within the United States as well, of local capital and global capital. A new city, a new downtown, for Los Angeles has not had a well-developed downtown over the years throughout its 200 years of growth. And as I say, it also reflects the postmodern experience internally as well. The Bonaventure has become a focal point for the debate on postmodernism ever since its discovery as a postmodern's hyperspace by Fred Jameson some years ago. It began with Fred Jameson's own personal experience in the Bonaventure Hotel in a professional meeting where most of the people going to attend the conferences and sessions found themselves getting lost within the interior space of the Bonaventure Hotel. The only way you can understand the nature of the argument that Jameson and others have developed over the years is to actually move in and move through the Bonaventure Hotel. It's a landscape that's highly fragmented. It's a space that decenters you, makes you feel lost. And in this feeling of being lost, dislocated, you feel that your only recourse is to submit to authority. You're helpless. You're made helpless. You're peripheralized. You're lost in these spaces. And the way you accommodate yourself to them and the way you survive in them is essentially to submit to forms of overseeing, social control, authority, often invisible, by the way, because part of being lost is that even when you're willing to submit to authority, you can't find it. The postmodernity of the Bonaventure, thus, is not in its shell. Its shell, stylistically, the architects would insist, is not postmodern in style, but is instead late modern or modernist in some form. It's difficult to find the main entrance. There's a pedestrian entrance, but the pedestrian entrance is hidden in a concrete bunker that makes one feel this couldn't possibly be the entrance to a major hotel. Most of the entrances are flyover and walkways in the sky connected to other parts of the postmodern downtown of Los Angeles, where one gets equally lost trying to move around. One enters the building and one sees a kind of Bastille-like fortress that it consists of a series of columns. Amidst the columns are these funny little gondolas, the external elevators going up and down, presumably showing that the outside is inside and the inside is outside. The very metaphor, by the way, of the postmodern city itself. The outside becoming inside, the periphery becoming central, as in Orange County and elsewhere in the region, and the center becoming peripheral, as in downtown, becoming lost, becoming decentered from one's conventional and familiar understandings of behavior in the inner city. The lifts themselves are, the elevators themselves are indicators, the first indicators, the outside visual indicators of the strange spaces that one is going to find in maneuvering and traversing the inside of the hotel. There are shops that receive no customers, largely because the customers can't find them. There are constant pictures of people walking around, hotel guests walking around with their suitcases, totally lost, not knowing how to get out or get back into the hotel rooms that presumably are their refuge from the confusion. You walk into one entrance that seems like a major entrance, and to get to anywhere else you find you're blocked. You're blocked by elevator shafts, you're blocked by wonderful sitting spaces, great concrete chairs that encourage you to sit down and enjoy the space. But the spaces, those chairs are always empty because no one could possibly feel particularly relaxed in this internal space. The feeling that you have is this feeling of dislocation, an argument that was central to Jameson's response to this postmodern space. And that is the argument that we must develop a new way of understanding what I call spatiality, the spatiality of postmodernism, if we're going to be able to resist its very attractive lures. Postmodernity is not the construction of simple Disney worlds of fantasy, but it's the production of a kind of hyper-reality that is more real than reality itself. And it's a reality that has tremendous attractions to it. There are lots of things even inside this microcosm of the Bonaventure Hotel that are attractive, enjoyable, super modern, ultra clean, and indeed sometimes ultra engaging. You see this, as I said, inside the Bonaventure, and outside a kind of complex mirror reflection of the very nature of postmodern society and postmodern experience.
All right, so that was a rather long clip from the documentary, but I thought it was worth sharing. While that was running, one of our regular commenters, Political Economy 101, says, if you want to understand ideology, study neoliberal governance culture. So studying neoliberal governance culture gets you nowhere. And then Political Economy 101 later on says, you can't understand this. Well, what Fredric Jameson is pointing to is how our self-understanding and our understanding of our political options and the potential futures changed with what he'll call the postmodern moment or the late capitalist moment, which I think dates back to the end of the 50s or the end of the 60s. And he points to architecture as symptomatic of the political and ideological change that took place, particularly, I guess, within the realm of intellectuals like artists and architects and academics and so on, novelists, what have you. But particularly architecture, he says that Venturi's Learning from Las Vegas is a book to look to as defining the postmodern turn. And that's a book where they advocate for the Las Vegas Strip as a model for future architecture, breaking from modernism, the architecture of progressive capitalism, the architecture aimed at creating citizens within maybe a social democracy, and instead creating architectures that reinforce the new forms of subjectivity, which would probably be best defined as the subjectivity of the consumer. But there are other ways in which you could define it. But so I do think it's right to say that Jameson was theorizing about the post-liberal or the neoliberal or the postmodern moment from the perspective of a would-be Marxist critic who wanted to look for opportunities for working class power and change to emerge, but that he was incredibly pessimistic as well. Go ahead, Ashley.
And also that you want to understand these sorts of things so that you know where they won't emerge or where these opportunities are pretending to emerge. So one of the other, it's very helpful, this commenter actually. Another one of the comments that I saw fly by was, it's much better to focus on the ruling class's strategy than to get lost in all this. I apologize if I've mischaracterized your comment, but this is from my memory. But this is precisely why this is so useful. So as I was watching that clip, I was thinking about, well, what is the post-liberal city now? It's the 10-minute city, or what's it called? The 15-minute city, I should say. There's happiness architecture. Did you know that there's a whole movement, or now they call it well-being architecture because happiness sounded just a bit too flighty. So they like this this word that sounds a little bit more serious. But there's this notion that the architecture should be a way of engaging and creating you used a wonderful word earlier. Yes. That it's part of the cognitive infrastructure, that the built environment and your cognitive environment are all part of this cognitive infrastructure, that the two become, what is inside moves outside, the two become interchangeable, they move back and forth, that the subject is opened up, and that internal area, that internal space becomes this new, not necessarily new, but this space for like tilling a field. Your brain becomes the space where they till the field. Your brain becomes the space where they lay the foundations for the next building. So all of these things, this, what Jameson's talking about, this sort of like self-referential nature of postmodern architecture, you can see the continuation of that in this kind of post-liberal architecture, which is a destruction of the subject, and the subject becomes something that is part of the environment, becomes opened up. There is no separation of public and private anymore. The public is a trespassing into the private. But this is the strategy, conscious or not. This is the strategy of the ruling class, but it presents itself as a kind of anti-strategy. It presents itself as the opposite, even as anti-capitalist. So you will see claims makers who, organize around like well-being infrastructure, well-being architecture. They truly believe that they're being anti-capitalist.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is that the theory behind this was that the post-liberal, post-modern, late, what Jameson would call late capitalist moment was actually a post-capitalist moment. That we were in a post-industrial society. We were in an information society. We were in an electronic society, a consumer society. We were no longer in the society of dominated by the bourgeoisie and capitalist relations, and no longer in a society dominated by class struggle or working class politics or politics of radical change. There could be no radical change because society did not have any essential totalizing structure within it. It was just a society filled with fragments and little pleasures and nodes in a network, maybe, but it was not dominated by any kind of social relationship that would require a subjectivity of any kind. And also, because of that, the need to overcome the contradictions that had defined the early 20th century and the late 19th century had been erased because the utopia had arrived. We were in a post-industrial, post-work, post-capitalist society. This was fully automated gay space communism as the Bonaventure Hotel.
There was another comment as well that kind of illuminates some of the argument that I was trying to put across, where Kushlik says, I actually love the theory of architecture. I think it's about building an entire reality. It's the same as imagining the society you want to build. Fundamentally, it is that. Yes, that's exactly right. And it's very interesting that that architecture and psychology should be intermeshing so much and intermingling so much toward the present, where what is the society we wish to build? It is the society of the human mind, or an atomized kind of you building within the subject a kind of cognitive infrastructure that will then be mined later, that will then be exploited later. And this, again, to quote Chandler from the days before he went rogue, he says, I think in his neoliberal subject book, the subject is the end. That's it. There's nothing outside the subject. There's nothing beyond the subject. The subject is the purpose of global development policy. The subject is the purpose of resilience discourse. The subject is the be all and the end all. In my book, my new book, Significant Emotions, I put this as the subject is the object. The subject is the purpose, the point of everything. So it's so interesting that that's the society we want to, that is what we are imagining. That it's not like we are imagining, to a certain extent we are, like, there's this grand dreams exist in like Dubai, this sort of thing, but people kind of make fun of it and say, oh, that's all just a bit silly. And it follows a similar kind of self-referential path as the way that we used to look out at the stars. When we very first developed telescopes and so on. We wanted to look further and further and farther and farther, and gradually we've been throwing up satellites more often than not and turning them back on ourselves. And it's the same thing. We once dreamed of building these, luxury gay-based communist worlds, and more we dream of building infrastructure inside the human mind. That is the subject is the object. That's the end point.
Yeah. And so and Jameson brings these kinds of ideas up as well in his essay, because the idea that the kind of subjectivity that defines late capitalism is a schizophrenic subjectivity, kind of fits with that, where you've lost contact with an outside world and everything is filtered through your own internal infrastructure and eccentric delusions. So that the distinction between the outside and the inside has been lost to a schizophrenic. The schizophrenics often believe, like if you hear about people who think they're being gang stalked, they're projecting their own inner paranoia onto just random passersby. But the other thing that Jameson talked about quite a lot and tried to theorize about was the loss of a common literary language, or a common, like a cultural frame of reference for art, and along with that, the loss of a sense of a reality that extends beyond the individual or beyond their own private language. So the artistic language became private languages, eccentric, private, autobiographical art is what came to dominate. And he compares Van Gogh's peasant shoes to Andy Warhol's diamond shoes to make this point in the essay. So Jameson suggests that this nostalgic turn in art, and then he goes on to suggest that the nostalgic turn in art, this embrace of the pastiche in films like Body Heat, are a reaction to this loss of the ability of art and language to describe the real. So the no longer able to like reach beyond itself, but only putting like brush strokes on the canvas that are only brush strokes. We find ourselves losing sight of and being dislocated from any kind of historical development. And I wondered, as I read it, if that description of reality, if that prognosis is even more true today, or whether or not my thought that it is only reflects my age. When I think about history as understood through the culture, like American culture, particularly, I think, I kind of know, like I have some images and some signifiers that are related to the 20s, right? And I have, the 1920s and the 30s. There's a slew of images that come along with that. The 40s, maybe Humphrey Bogart in a fedora hat. The 50s, leather jackets. So like the 20s would be flapper girls. The 50s would be greasers and rock and roll. The 60s might range anywhere from uptight kids with crew cuts to hippies. The 70s is defined by disco culture and kind of a certain narcissistic hedonism. The 80s defined by return of an attempt at a return to the 50s and the new greed is good ideology. The 90s is, from my perspective, associated with grunge and an attempt to throw off the 80s. But then I get to the 2000s, right? The 0 years. And I can't reach back and say, this is what defined 2000 to 2010. And this is what defined the decade 2010 to 2020. Like I don't have cultural signifiers that I could just plop into place.
No, really?
No,
Like
well, yeah.
meme
Do you?
culture or like cancel culture, that sort of thing. But let me just, I wanted to
But what? No, but no.
kind of,
Don't go off from. But tell me.
no, I'm not going to.
Inform me. Okay. Good.
Oh no,
Sorry.
okay. Well, let's finish this thought. Let's finish this thought then.
Yeah. So I
I
mean,
don't
do you
know.
have?
Yeah,
would-
like the increased atomization around social media and mobile phone use or something like that might be something along the trajectory. I'm not sure if how much
Yeah.
I subscribe to this.
Like the maybe iPhones but that doesn't come along with like a change in clothing fashions and the kind of look of the culture.
Oh,
For
it's
my
90s.
Yeah, it's still the 90s into 2000s.
Yeah, which is great because like obviously I peaked in 1997, so yeah, and so did fashion, it's all back now, and I'll go out and buy it. But okay, so there were a few ways that let's rein this in and try to bring it back and give us some sort of conceptualization here. So as we're talking, I think maybe we can make sense of some of this this self-referential, so using Jameson and this kind of like self-referential nature of so much of like postmodern culture and this erosion of the boundaries between self and inside world and outside world. We can also kind of make sense of that perhaps better through a person who's also perhaps tangentially associated with the Frankfurt School, Habermas, right? So Habermas's idea of the public and the private. So that's what I was getting at when I was saying that we have this erosion of the public sphere. So Habermas obviously goes into the development of the public sphere in the like coffee houses of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. And then you have the development of a private sphere. And this was actually an important part of modernity, an important development of modernity, that you had this separation. Previously, I think Norbert Elias talks about this. Previously, you had the public sphere and the private sphere were coextensive, like, court culture, that sort of thing was an extension of the private sphere. But this separation associated with Enlightenment modernity was quite important. And post-modernity sees the erosion of that, sees the erosion of the public sphere associated with civil society, Doug, the erosion of civil society. And this is where we find ourselves at the moment, and is making it increasingly difficult to have any kinds of movements. Because of the erosion of the public sphere and everything having to be, well, what does this mean for me? What does this mean for my feelings? Becomes like the way that you make sense of any kind of social problem. Like on my own podcast last week, I was talking about the mindfulness phenomenon. And the week before, I was talking about mental health in universities. And one of my patrons said, Eli, Stamata. One of my patrons said, well, like there's a kernel of truth in this. There are, all these problems faced by grad students, et cetera, and the stress. And I said, it's very interesting that we find it difficult to make sense of social problems in any other way except how does it make us feel? And then we find it difficult to then broach or make sense of an issue that doesn't really make us feel bad, like everything. The start and end point is in our individual psychology and subjectivity. We're so used to thinking about that because of this divide, this erosion of public and private. We think of all public problems as essentially personal, individual problems. And that's a very difficult thing to get over. But as I responded to my patron, if you go back to slavery, and, Oscar Wilde said that one of the worst, in his Soul of Man Under Socialism, one of the worst things about slavery was that the people who were enslaved often didn't feel bad. They didn't even know of the injustice of their situation. It had to be told of it by others. And you have this, there were lots of people who justified slavery on the basis of the fact that they were kind to their slaves. And Oscar Wilde continues, when they were free, so free indeed, they were free to starve. Many of them bitterly regretted the new situation. Well, how would we make sense of that now? We would be, I think, utterly bewildered. We would find that a very difficult problem to grapple with. And I think I see this all the time where people are saying, well, if it makes us feel better, then it must be good. They cannot see like the totality, the grand scheme within which things operate. everything is very much self-contained, or the brain is like the totality. Everything starts and ends there.
Yeah. I do feel like we are that the postmodern, in the terms that Jameson described it, has been, intensifying, and precisely in the way that you mean, like everything, like he said, all of the great books or the literary writers of the late 20th and early 21st century were working in their own private languages, and they no longer had a referent outside of the artwork itself, and not even a referent to some formal lineage or development within art, but rather they developed their own kind of schizophrenic private approaches to creating art. So we have the same approach to our lives and to politics today to a large degree. However, there is a lot of panic about not private languages and self-expression in terms of um, emotionally realizing yourself, but rather there's a lot of panic right now about public discourse, about claims about the world, about people trying to formulate political opinions, and that's something that's come up in the last 20 years. That's certainly a product of the internet culture that we're living in, and social media companies that dominate the media today. Some people will argue with me that I'm hyperbolic about the risk of the massive censorship apparatuses being built, because it's only being built in reaction to the massive expansion in personal freedom and expression that's come along with the internet. So I guess the question is, are we at a moment where the postmodern, post capitalist, post liberal world order is actually in crisis? Marx thinks I'm wrong about that, but I
Right.
wonder
Okay.
if it
So
might be.
yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So the other thing that I wanted to bring up was the influence of Kenneth Burke on Jameson. And this is also another reason why, when reading Jameson, I went, that's me, because I also love Kenneth Burke. And Kenneth Burke was an influence on Joseph Gusfield as well. And when you're talking about the example of the, oh gosh, what's it called? The something hotel. Why can't I remember?
Bonaventure, the Bonaventure Hotel.
Yeah, the Bonaventure Hotel. So that is an example of taking something as a representative anecdote. And representative anecdote is a method of distilling history, I suppose, which is drawn from Kenneth Burke. So for Burke, human activity it's all art. Like, you can study art because human activity is like art. It's just symbolic. It's signifying. And so when you can read history and tell history through representative anecdotes, like a hotel, or like I do in my new book, where I talk about Marx versus Pareto, or Pascal versus Voltaire. You can have these representative anecdotes that are like moments in a drama. So what's the setting of the drama of our postmodern world? It's the Bonaventure Hotel. And it acts like human action activity can be studied like it's enacting an underlying plot structure. So in this, the representative anecdote encapsulates strategically the essence of a phenomenon, which allows, from the essence of that phenomenon, the study of broader cultural, social, historical patterns. without needing to like give an inventory of all the hotels that are just like this. There's a paper by Brummett, can't remember the first name, that talks about, that really explains Burke's, because Burke can be really difficult to read, but really explains Burke's representative anecdotes really well. He says, one should ask oneself, if this discourse were based upon a story, an anecdote, what would the form, outline, or bare bones of that story be? So, for example, Burke suggested that psychological discourse during his time, or he really hated like cognitivism, it could be understood as rooted in anecdotes. The representative anecdote was the human as a rat, or the human as a reflex conditioned animal, or the human as a set of chemicals. That is the representative anecdote from which you can learn so much about society. So now what you were talking about before about language and so on, all of this, so thinking about human action as symbolic action means that you can study it and you can understand it and you can interpret it like you would understand a work of fiction, like a piece of art, right? You can interpret human action in the exact same way. But people took that message really, really literally, so that everything is just like art. It's just text. It's just symbolism. And therefore, everything can be tackled at the level of art, language, and symbolism. That if you just get the signifying structures correct, then somehow, some way, you will, by getting people to talk about things correctly, you will be able to solve deeper problems, because everything is human action is symbolic. But what that accidentally did was play into that core insight that I mentioned at the very beginning, that ideology is solving in imagination a material issue that cannot be solved in the realm of materialism, right? And so we're stuck operating constantly at the level of symbolism and so on, which I think Gusfield gets at really, really well with his idea of like symbolic crusade. Like, we gave up on all that materialism. That's it. This is the end of history. We kind of all accept that now. There's no, that the big questions of who gets what and how society should be structured have all been answered. Now we move simply to the realm of symbolic crusades. We fight over values. We fight over whose values should be recognized as the dominant values of the culture. So we think that we're sitting in Jameson's tradition, and we're doing, we're operating at the level of language and culture. But the problem is, we don't realize that we're solely operating at the language of culture, and that these problems can't be solved there. Obviously, you do have to understand the world, and doing that is part of, you have to signify it. You have to engage in symbolic action to understand the world. But at the same time, you cannot solely do that. There has to be a back and forth. There has to be a dialectic of theory and practice. That I think part of our condition, our postmodern condition, is the giving up on that material world, and the loss of our ability to act on it, and therefore we're kind of stuck. Part of the void, the political void in which we find ourselves, is that we are stuck in the realm of language and symbolism, and we can't quite figure out how to move beyond it.
Yeah, not only just stuck in the realm of language, but stuck in the realm, according to Jameson, of private languages which have no symbolic referent at all, like that, except for internally or maybe autobiographically. But the what I would say though is that Jameson was some sort of Marxist, and he was trying to point to the fact that the change in the culture, this postmodern turn, this post-ideological world that we were inhabiting after, let's say, the 70s, it was itself a product of historical time. It was a product of the social, political, and material changes. And so I think the question for us is, given that, look, we're not alone. Like Sublation Media, you're frozen again, but Sublation Media is not alone in wanting to return to civil society and think about, how we might change our social relationships on the level of everyday life and organize a new kind of political movement from the ground up. And, hell, it makes sense after the pandemic for people to want to go back outside again and touch grass. But the grass now would be civil society itself, or the reality of our social relationships that take place in the real world. And so as we are all kind of thinking about trying to do that, I think it's worthwhile to consider Jameson. And also in the next podcast in the parent room, we're going to be talking about Rousseau. And I think that when we think about Jameson's feelings of nostalgia and when we think about Jameson's feeling of a lack of progress or the ways in which historical time had been overcome and therefore positive change or revolutionary change had been thrown aside, we should think about this quote from Rousseau, which is this: discontented with your present state for reasons which threaten your unfortunate descendants with still greater discontent, you will perhaps wish it were in your power to go back. And this feeling should be a panegyric on your first ancestors, a criticism of your contemporaries, and a terror to the unfortunates who will come after you. So I would just say that we should listen to Rousseau, not attempt to return to the past, which we might imagine to be simpler, happier times where we had our wits about us. Not necessarily to just criticize ourselves and our contemporaries, but rather to think about think about the children who are the future, after all, and their children, and the children's children's children, and the future, and hope to create conditions now where we're not condemning them to a misery that we might not even be able to imagine. So, yeah, I'm going to leave it there. Join us in the parrot room for a discussion of Rousseau. There's going to be a bunch of people there. I think that last week we had a good turnout. People are enjoying discussing this and turn towards civil society and the ways in which we're trying to reintroduce some liberalism into the socialist milieu. And thanks for watching this week.
In the case of nuclear or radiological fallout, people